At the end of the 1980s, it really felt like the world was beginning to turn a corner. Japan had been undergoing a massive economic spurt, mainly due to their export of consumer electronics. The absolute contributing factor to the Game Boy's runaway success was the fact that it was cheap. A device like the Game Boy was perfect for all of these new emerging economies here in Europe. Konami themselves had never been afraid to be early adopters for new devices. At this point in time, Konami had already started working on SNES games, so of course they would have been a shoo-in for early Game Boy partners. Konami decided their first game for the brand new Game Boy would be a Castlevania game. The first handheld Castlevania game, and one of the first Game Boy games ever released, Castlevania The Adventure launched in North America and in Japan under the title of Dracula Densetsu just in time for that big aspirational Christmas 1989. If you didn't know by now, the whole Castlevania thing is Dracula gets up about every 100 years to go around drinking blood and doing all that Dracula stuff. No matter how many times Dracula comes back, the Belmont clan are always waiting for him. Castlevania 1 was set in about 1690 and it starred Simon Belmont. Castlevania The Adventure is set 100 years prior to that and is about Simon's great-grandpa, Christopher Belmont. If you've seen my video on the origins of the Castlevania series, then you'll remember that it's the Japanese manuals that have way more story than the localized releases, and the exact same is true here. Before Dracula was the great vampire king, he was an evil sorcerer. He summoned demons from the underworld and he spread fear throughout Transylvania, until one day Christopher Belmont rose up and rushed to the Dark Castle to defeat the transformed devil, Count Dracula. Christopher had previously been mentioned in the Japanese manual for the first Castlevania and also for Vampire Killer on the MSX, which is the first time Castlevania was actually ever released here in Europe. The US and PAL releases of this game, though, are almost deliberately ambiguous. They seem to be suggesting that Castlevania The Adventure is a Simon Belmont game, and they position this game as a sequel to the first two games on the NES. Castlevania 3 was released the same year as this game, and Castlevania 3 is also a prequel that happens to be set 100 years before the first game, so I figure this is why Castlevania The Adventure was altered for Western audiences. Castlevania 3 was later retconned to be set 200 years before the first game, which makes Christopher a descendant of Trevor Belmont. Castlevania The Adventure takes place over 4 levels, and if you think that sounds short, don't worry, because they are long-ass levels. The first level is pretty much like the first level in every Castlevania game. It's like a countryside, graveyard, all that kind of stuff. The second stage is a labyrinth. I mean a genuine labyrinth of caves. Remember like writing maps on bits of paper and you'd like fold it up and keep it in the cartridge case? The third stage has these neat moving floors and platforms. It's actually super heart racing. This is very, very cool. And then the last level is Dracula's Castle, which is basically all of the previous things all combined. But there's now pixel perfect jumps, there's a mini boss rush. Before long though, you're on to Big Vlad, you whip his head off and then bang, 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 you save the day. I feel like I make the game sound really short with that description. It's very similar to the first Castlevania game in that if you know what you're doing, you can probably clear this game in half an hour. You could probably do this on one life. I, however, did not find this game to be short because it is so hard. Like a lot of the first wave of games on the Game Boy, the controls feel a little bit sluggish and the game engine doesn't have the smooth scrolling that we got in later games on the Game Boy. That means you have to be super careful when you play, so it does feel like quite an authentic Castlevania experience. There are a few things that stand out that make this feel like quite a peculiar Castlevania game. There's a few departures from the formula. So instead of stairs, you're climbing a lot of ropes. There are also no sub-weapons in this game, which I think is the first Castlevania game without sub-weapons. You do collect hearts, but they actually restore your health, which if this wasn't a Castlevania game, then that would be normal, but in a Castlevania game, that seems mental. The game does have whip upgrades, which is awesome. You start with a normal whip, you go up through the chain whip, and then you eventually get a chain whip that's capable of firing fireballs. But the downside to that is each time you take damage, the whip is downgraded by 1 step. So this means that you rarely have that top level whip, which is a shame because that would have really helped to balance out the difficulty. I would say the visuals in this game do look pretty primitive, but they are on par with other games released at the beginning of the life cycle of the Game Boy. I do think it would be harsh to judge it badly on this front. As you might have expected, there was an extremely small team making this game. Programmer Yoshiaki Yamada had previously worked on Track and Field 2 with Matsuhiro Ueno from the original Castlevania trilogy. Every other member of this team was completely new. I think that's kind of cool that these lads were given that opportunity. And what's even better is they were all credited with their real names, and that's actually significant. Probably due in part to it being one of the first games available for the Game Boy and it not really having that much competition, Castlevania The Adventure sold extremely well. Konami claimed in fact it was the first Game Boy game to sell 2.5 million units. Turning over $100 million at retail makes Castlevania The Adventure the most successful Castlevania game ever, and this is all reflected in reviews at the time of release. The team managed to distill enough of the Castlevania formula into this game onto a brand new platform with a whole bunch of limitations. Of all three Castlevania games released on the Game Boy, this is the one I have the most to talk about because this is the first one and I think this one is the most significant. Castlevania The Adventure didn't launch here in Europe until 1991, and by then the second game had already been developed and released in Japan. Dracula Densetsu 2 came out in summer 1991 in Japan, and it came out in the US as Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, with the European release following the next year, which is the same year Super Castlevania 4 released on the SNES. Nintendo of America finally went mask off and revealed explicitly that this game was about Christopher Belmont. This was the first time that audiences outside of Japan were introduced to Christopher Belmont, with the first game now retroactively being adjusted to this new canon. Belmont's Revenge is set 15 years after the previous game. Dracula didn't die in the finale of the previous game. His essence had survived, but he was unable to take physical form. So Dracula kidnaps / seduces Christopher's teenage son Soleil Belmont and transforms him into a sexy demon boy for reasons. Either way, Christopher treks off to save his son from all the hot sex he's probably getting, I don't know. Belmont's Revenge has a slightly different setup in that instead of it being a linear path, there are now 4 castles and you can do them in any order, so it's kind of like a Mega Man game, but the core experience is snapped back to that core Castlevania experience that you would expect. Chris's base movement speed is slightly quicker, the controls are more responsive, this feels much more in line with the games on the NES, and there are small quality of life improvements, like you can now whip on ropes. Sub-weapons are back. Pushing up an attack will let you use one of the 2 sub-weapons available in the game. In the West, this was Holy Water and the Axe, and in Japan, it was Holy Water and the Cross. Hearts now refill your ammo, which is what they're supposed to do, which now means that wall meat makes a big reappearance. It is just perfectly Castlevania distilled down onto the Game Boy. Belmont's Revenge takes the foundation of Castlevania The Adventure, and it applies all the lessons Konami had learned in the 18 months since releasing Castlevania 1. The team who made Castlevania 2 had also worked on the Game Boy versions of Skate or Die, Operation C and Parodius, and so they were far more savvy with leveraging speedier scrolling, more responsive controls, and just look at that graphical fidelity. This is the same 4-color palette, it's the same hardware, the teams are just now far more used to it. Look at the detail and the contrast in that pixel art, it's a world away from that first game. They're so much more dialed into how the hardware works now. Those flicker effects that you can see there are cheeky ways to abuse the refresh rate of the original DMG Game Boy to try to artificially increase the number of shades that you could get on screen. That's brilliant. It does of course work far better on the original hardware, but this demonstrates that big jump in team knowledge between these 2 games. Retro Gamer magazine consistently say that this is one of the best Game Boy games ever, and I'm tempted to agree with them. This is a real high point, not just for the Game Boy, but also for Castlevania. The music is also absolutely banging. The Game Boy had some amazing music, and actually this might be up there with some of my favourites. Rock Castle, absolute banger. Nearly 10 years after the release of Castlevania The Adventure, Konami released the 3rd and final Castlevania Game Boy game, Castlevania Legends. This game came out in 1997 in Japan and well into 1998 everywhere else. This was the same year Symphony of the Night came out. Known in Japan as Akumajo Dracula Dark Knight Prelude, Castlevania Legends is about Sonia Belmont, the first Belmont. This story is set in 1450, which makes it the earliest chapter in the story yet, and it was originally intended to be the origin of the entire Castlevania canon. Ironically, the story is very thin on the ground here. I'm pretty sure it just says Dracula exists, Sonia exists, and so she's gonna go make sure Dracula doesn't exist anymore. I'm pretty sure that's actually it. What is pretty neat though is about halfway through the game there is a boss fight with Alucard, and then when she defeats him, Alucard's all like, "Oh well, take care my lover," insinuating that there's some kind of romance going on between these two, which is very interesting. In terms of the gameplay, this is some of the most sophisticated gameplay of the Castlevania trilogy. Sonia can now control jumps in midair, she can change direction and whip in different directions while jumping, which is really good because this game is a lot harder than the previous two. In previous Castlevania games, you've got enemies like the Medusa heads, which will spawn indefinitely across some levels, and that's fine. In Legends, all of the enemies spawn in with that same level of aggressive regularity. Instead of the traditional approach to sub-weapons which the previous Castlevania game had, you now have these large super moves which are unlocked by consuming the souls of defeated bosses. I love that. That is so unique for Castlevania. That's very, very cool. Sonia also has an additional burning mode which you get by pushing both jump and attack at the same time, and she kind of goes like Super Saiyan where she's like glowing and touching enemies will hurt them. She's invincible for a short period of time. I think the whip does like double damage. That's very cool. You can only use it once per level, so just save it for the bosses. Anyway, you get to the end of the game, you fight Dracula, and Dracula's all like, "Oh, you'll never defeat me. I'm around forever." And then Sonia then swears, she's like, "Well, as long as there's a Dracula, there'll always be a Belmont." It's a really cool ending. I quite like the idea that this is setting up the beginning of the mythology, and by suggesting that Sonia and Alucard have a romantic relationship, they're kind of suggesting that the Belmont bloodline has Alucard's blood in it, which is very interesting. Castlevania Legends was released very, very late in the Game Boy library. It is one of the last dozen games ever released for the Game Boy. The honest truth is Castlevania Legends is far from an exceptional Castlevania game. It is a decent enough Game Boy game, but it's hard to compare it to some of the best games on the platform like Mega Man or Pokemon or games like that. But my point is, cheap was a great motivating factor in the 1990s. At this point in time, the Game Gear was out, the Nomad was out, the Game Boy Color was on the horizon, and yet here this game was as like a last hurrah, one last cheap, affordable Castlevania game to round out the generation, to round out the decade. It may not have been a great game, but it's a nice footnote for the Game Boy, I think, and a nice footnote for the legacy of cheap, affordable games which the Game Boy had stood for. Castlevania on the Game Boy represents an era of changing tides at Konami. Konami were never afraid to support new hardware, but their attitudes were slow to change. But here we see staff getting credited for the first time. We're seeing writers attempt to give the franchise actual grounding, actual lore. We're seeing female protagonists in the era of girl power. I think it's really nice that Castlevania bookends the entire legacy of the Game Boy, from one of the first games released to one of the last games released. Castlevania The Adventure is far better than people give it credit for. Belmont's Revenge is a certified banger. While this corner of the Castlevania series may not have had the big lasting impact as a lot of the console games did, we did get one of the very best selling games on the entire platform and one of the highest regarded. Konami were killing it when it came to these Game Boy games, and clearly they identified that this was a definite growth area for Castlevania. There were no Castlevania games released exclusively on the Game Boy Color, but it would be the games on the Game Boy Advance which really took off. I'm slowly working my way through the entire Castlevania series on this channel, so if you want to see upcoming episodes of that, please subscribe, and please check out my previous uploads to see earlier entries in this series. Thanks very much everybody, and until next time, ta-da.